Okay, testing. All right, good evening, folks. It is June 5th, 2025, and we're here to talk about the Wetland Map Updates. Thanks for coming today. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be available upon request. We have two people here in person joining us, and looks like 9 people are logged on live on Teams for those of you in the room. My name is Laura LaPierre. I'm the Wetlands Program Manager and have been working on the map updates for probably 7 years. And the Otter Creek mapping for like 5 years. So it's been a big effort, and I'm really happy today to be able to present how we've done with it. And with me is Zapata Courage, who is your district wetlands ecologist for Addison and Rutland counties. Do you want to say anything, Zapata?
Hi, everyone. If you have any questions as this goes on after the meeting, and then please reach out to me. Happy to work with you.
Yep, so the way this is going to go is Zapata is going to be watching the chat while I'm presenting. What I have is a somewhat short presentation about just informational about what the maps are and how to comment and such. If you have any clarifying questions, please jump in. You can type in the chat or raise your hand, and I can answer those on the fly, but we'll save the specific like location questions and more in-depth questions for once I'm finished with the presentation. And hopefully the presentation will answer a lot of your questions. And just setting up my screen. For those of you who are virtual, real quick housekeeping. You are all muted right now. So if you'd like to speak, there's the microphone button. You can also use this chat box or raise your hand. So my presentation is real basic. I'm going to go over which maps we're updating, what we use the maps for, where in Vermont we have updated the maps, where we're making those changes, why we're doing these edits, and how you can review this draft information and provide comment. And when I'm done the presentation, we can have more of a discussion about this. So I will dive right in. So there's a few different wetland map layers. So for Wetlands Mapping 101, I have this slide that is of various mapping for Middlebury. And there's a national wetlands inventory that is in every state of the country. I don't think they've covered the entire country yet, but they did finish Vermont quite a while ago, and now we're going through a second or third iteration in some cases of wetland mapping. And that National Wetlands Inventory is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it also includes rivers and lakes systems as well as lacustrine and riverine. And that is the standard that the country uses, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to approve of it. And all of this mapping that we're looking to put on has been approved by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, is actually already on the national map. The second is the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory, the VSWI. It's a mouthful of an acronym. It's managed by our program in Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. It includes which wetlands are regulated. When the rules first came into place in 1990 for state wetlands regulations. Only wetlands that were mapped or contiguous to mapped were protected. Since 2010, that has changed, where there were wetlands presumed to be significant, and now they're listed as wetlands with certain characteristics are class 2 protected insignificant wetlands. The VSWI started as an adoption of the National Wetlands Inventory and was updated in 2010 with the revisions to the National Wetlands Inventory. So what we're doing here is fairly similar. Then there's also the wetlands advisory layer. That is a more informal layer. It doesn't require public comment and such to add to it. We felt like we weren't updating the maps quick enough and wanted a means to add things for people to have information about where wetlands might be. And this is not a jurisdictional layer. It's managed by the program, and it's based off of aerial interpretation or from staff going to sites in the field and such. And we update it quite regularly. What we're talking about today is an update to the Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. The National Wetlands Inventories, like I said, has already been updated. But our layer, we're going through the approved process of doing a statewide notice, public meeting, public comment period, and such. And the map has many uses and is incredibly useful for folks in Vermont who own land, are thinking to purchase land, are thinking of developing. There are many ways that it can be used, land appraisals, wildlife surveys, just getting a general idea of the distribution of where wetlands are at. In some states, they even use it for assessment for property tax, but it's also useful for preliminary site assessments and identifying potential regulatory areas. But it is derived from aerial interpretation primarily. So at a zoomed out scale, you're not going to see everything. We can see a lot more, and I'll get more into it, but I also want to make sure to mention that there are some misuses of the map. It can't be used to determine definitively presence absence of wetlands being in existence, and also to determine if you need a permit or not. You need a permit if you have an activity that's occurring with a wetland or the 50-foot buffer zone, and you really need to be able to have an on-the-ground delineation for that. If you have a mapped wetland on your property, you know generally where it is, and that can be really helpful for planning. So our statewide VSWI update started with the Missisquoi Basin area that's highlighted here. And we updated that in 2023. Right now, we're talking about updates to the Winooski watershed, the Little Otter, Lewis Creek, and yeah, Otter Creek, Little Otter, Lewis Creek, and also the Pike River watershed, because that was not included in the rest of the Missisquoi, and we want to make sure that we get that area. That's part of Lake Carmi. So after we're finished with this update, we have completed National Wetlands Inventory of the Connecticut River Basin and Northern Lake Champlain Direct, that we will be doing another iteration of public comment process and such. So just so you know, that's coming up too. And then the remainder of the state, we're hoping to have updated on the VSWI by 2026. So here's a map that shows a little bit better the towns and such that are involved with this area. It's quite a large area of the state. That's why we're having this meeting in Brandon. It's kind of centrally located for the Otter Creek Basin. And it touches nearly every single county in the state in these three areas. But it doesn't, because it's based off of watershed, there are some towns that are partly included in this map, just because it's based off of slope aspect more than political boundaries. Okay, so why update? This is displaying how we used to do wetland mapping. We used to actually physically draw on a map where the wetlands were. This is a great image from the National Wetlands Inventory of someone doing that work. And then it was later digitized. So you may see some issues with the mapping right now where there's a pond, but the mapping is like elsewhere, just because it didn't get added correctly. You see here a big part of the Winooski watershed is actually from the 1970s vintage. In the Otter Creek, it's a bit more recently done. So having better technology where we're using things like digital elevations, we're getting aerial images every year now, leaf on, leaf off. We can see a whole lot more. And there's much better technology. Thanks for joining. Just so you know, we are recording.
I understood that. I
Okay.
didn't understand is that this is the location that was listed as the town office.
Sorry, yeah.
As the, clerk's office. We figured it out now.
Okay, so the updates are making some basic corrections, refining boundaries and such. So here's an image just showing where there's just a discrepancy where the wetland was just added onto where the house is, where it's really meant to be within the cattail. So those sorts of shifts are happening. Boundaries are being refined because we have a better sense of, seeing more of the details there. There's areas that couldn't be detected previously. If you think of like looking at aerial images from the 1970s and 80s, they're kind of pixelated. There's a lot more detail now so that you can find wetlands that you couldn't in the past. And there's also some subtractions to the mapping, areas where with this better information, we're able to say, hey, there's actually no wetland there. So we're removing those, cleaning them up. Really the critical piece here is what we're doing is we're mapping those wetlands that categorically meet class 2 protection status. So these newly mapped areas, where there are newly mapped areas, we're not creating more regulated wetland. Those are wetlands that were there before and were protected. Now we're making it more visible for the public to be able to tell where these wetlands are. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the mapper tool. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to take a look at it. So the mapper tool starts off showing the areas that are under consideration right now. There's a place up here where you can type in an address to zoom in to. And here if you're zoomed in a bit, you can see that there's different colors, there's a base map and such. You can toggle between this drawing or an aerial image through this right here. And the different symbology, the orange areas are areas that are currently on the maps. And this is actually downtown Brandon. I think you guys can see that. And the orange areas are going to be deleted from the maps. The teal areas.
The orange areas are going to be deleted from them.
Yep. Yep, those are the areas where with the better information, we know those spots are probably not wetland. So the teal areas are new areas. Hi, thanks for joining. And the areas that are green are really areas of overlap. Are areas that are currently on the map that are being kept. Does that make sense?
So the blue areas
Yep.
are added.
Yes. So for example, there's this spot up in the north. And you can pick it, the address, or you can zoom right into it. And you can click on that polygon to be able to get more information about it. Like here, it says that the mapping organization is university or college. They should all be saying that because the University of St. Mary's of Minnesota did the mapping work for us.
Laura,
Yep.
could you please repeat the question from the room prior to answering it so everyone online can hear it well?
Yep, certainly. So that last question was just verifying that the teal areas are additions and the orange areas are deletions.
And the green remains.
Yep. So when you have one of these shapes clicked on, you'll see this pop-up window and there is a place, there's a button that you can select that where you can submit a comment. And it's real basic, just email address and the comment that you want to provide. This is one of two ways that you can, three ways you can provide comment. You can provide comment here today or at the meeting in Montpelier next week. You can provide a comment through this mapping tool to give like a very specific locational comment. And then you can go on to the environmental notice bulletin and you can provide a comment there. So if you have like something that's a bit more general, I'd recommend there or today. You can also email me as well. That's fine. For these polygon locational specific comments, what's really helpful for us is if you are in your comment, give us information on why you believe the wetland is not class 2. Like maybe you have a photo of the site with a cactus on it, like you won't, but you know, just to be silly. Like if the area is like entirely a manure pit, for example, we worked pretty hard to make sure that manure pits weren't included because that's not what we're protecting here. That's not what our program's for. If you know, it's a really small area and it's not connected to a stream, that's really helpful. If you have delineation information, that would be helpful too. The comment doesn't, in this program, just has a space for writing something. So if you want to also provide an attachment, you can send that separately. So that's how the mapper tool works. Real quick, since we're in the Otter Creek Basin, I wanted to give some of the numbers of what we have here. So there's this area involves 6 different counties, 54 towns. There were a lot of field checks of the mapping. So we had the mapping was being produced by St. Mary's of Minnesota. Obviously they're not in Vermont. They've mapped in almost every single state of the country. They're very well known for doing national wetlands inventory, but Vermont's special. So we had our specialists go out and be able to assess in the field over 1,700 sites. So that was really great to be able to have that local information. What turned out is with the removals and the additions, on average, there's a 20% increase in identified wetland area within this basin. So it's not distributed evenly. So for example, there's 1,200 acres that's added to the town of Ripton, which makes sense to me because it's very forested. And in the past, it was really difficult to use aerial images to see that. In the town of Lincoln, it's 1,300 more acres. But then Brandon actually has 300 less acres mapped as wetland. And Leicester, it's cool, Leicester's here representing today. There's 200 less acres mapped than there was before. So like there's gains and losses here and there, but overall, like the net change is less in that town. We also looked at how this stuff, how the wetland maps also intersect with other natural resources. So river corridors are also a protected area where the river might shift to. And about 50% of the river corridors that are mapped within the Otter Creek Basin are wetland from the data that we collected. We also found that 25% of the known significant natural communities are mapped wetland areas now as well. So these are protected areas for a reason, and this, kind of shows how that overlap is useful for maintaining those functions and values that we have in the state. Yeah, so that is my brief presentation. I'll leave up this maps so you can see be reminded of what areas of the state are being updated with this. And it looks like there's some questions coming in. So I will start by reading those that have come in, and we're pinball between the chat and the people who are present today. So I will start with the question that came up here from Craig Hendel.
Let's start with
sorry.
the first one from Melanie Needle, which was asking just the basic question of what does it mean to be on notice? What does on notice mean? And you can see the response that I gave her if you'd like to read that out and elaborate if you'd like to.
Okay, thanks, Zapata, for answering it. Okay, so Zapata says that what it means for the mapping to be on notice is that it's legally before the mapping can be adopted to the VSWI map, it has to go on public notice to give a 30-day period of time for public comments and questions to be submitted, which will then need to be addressed prior to adoption. So all the comments that are coming in today, we're answering to the best of our ability today. But we will in the end have a responsiveness summary document with questions and answers to be part of the record before anything is adopted.
And when does the public hearing period for this end?
June 20th.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions from the room before we go to the next one in the chat? Yes. And can you state your name, please?
Julie Delphia. So the items that are identified in blue, if they're accepted on the map, what restrictions do those properties have, and are there any areas outside of that blue area that would have restrictions?
Great question. So for the virtual folks, I'll repeat it, is what's basically the implications of having a mapped wetland on a property when there wasn't a wetland mapped there before. So those are the teal areas on the maps. And that is indicating generally that we believe there's a wetland there. If someone wants to develop on that property, regardless of if it's mapped or not, you should be looking for wetlands, because any wetland that is considered significant class 2 requires a permit for any activities within the wetland or its 50-foot buffer zone, unless it's an allowed use, which we have like a list of uses that can be done without a permit. But like the first step is just knowing whether you have a wetland or not. So the individuals who have new mapping on their property will know better that there's wetland there. If they get it delineated, it could be and is likely different from what the exact edges of the wetland is on the map, because that was drawn by someone in Minnesota looking at an aerial image, and the boundaries on site can be very precise because it's based off of soils, plants, and hydrology. So, like, I'm getting a little long-winded, sorry. It's basically it's a useful planning tool. However, you do still need to get it delineated. If there isn't wetland where the map says there's wetland, that's going to be happening a whole lot less than there has in the past. But like, we're not regulating things that are not wetland or buffer zones. So the on the ground review always trumps what the map says, and we can update the maps later for that specific project.
But the blue areas would have a buffer zone around them. These would be now considered class 2 wetlands.
Let me ask a clarifying question. There is a blue color on these maps. Blue is considered open water, which
No,
are lake,
not
ponds,
water.
and streams. And then there's that light teal color.
So the teal color, so.
Yeah.
I'm obviously looking at the map of Leicester.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's a bunch of new little teal dots
Mhm.
on people's property. So the question I have is this map indicating new class 2 wetlands that would then have the restrictions of a class 2 wetland with a 50-foot buffer?
It is identifying existing class 2 wetlands that are not currently included on the map. So the wetland rules state that wetlands that are over half an acre in size, wetlands that are connected to streams, wetlands that are vernal pools over 2,500 feet in elevation are all protected class 2 wetlands. And the unfortunate thing is that they're not all on the maps, and we recognize that a lot of people want the maps to display everything that's on there. So we've gone through this effort of using the newer technologies to identify them. So if it's not mapped today and someone wants to do something in that class 2 wetland, it still needs a permit. regardless of if it's mapped or not. Does that answer your question?
Let me try again. The purpose, the goal of this project, or the goal of this process, is to increase the accuracy of wetland mapping throughout the state. And those wetlands already exist on the ground. Under the Vermont wetland rules, any wetland that is a half acre in size, above 2,500 feet in elevation, a wetland that is 2,500 square feet and associated with a water body, a wetland that is a vernal pool or contains a rare, threatened, or endangered species, they're already under our rules a class 2 wetland with a protected 50-foot buffer. But not all of those wetlands are currently mapped. That's one of the goals of this process, is to try and map as many of those as possible so that when a landowner goes and looks at the mapping, they see that, oh, I might actually have a wetland on my property, and it might actually be jurisdictional under the wetland rules. I should be checking to see if I need a wetland permit. Too often we find out that somebody looked at the maps, which we know are outdated, and they go, there was nothing mapped on my property, so I built my driveway, and now I'm in violation. So the goal is, they're not new wetlands. Those wetlands exist on the land today. It's new mapping of those wetlands to give better information to people who are using these programs.
So the newly identified teal
Mhm.
wetlands
Correct.
are going to be mapped as class 2 wetlands with a 50-foot buffer restriction.
Correct. And they've been identified. The reason why they're going on the maps is because they have met one of those criteria I just mentioned. Either they're on their own, they're over a half acre in size, or they're already connected to mapped wetlands, or they're a vernal pool, or they're associated with a water body. And that is the criteria that the Minnesota folks have to follow in order to have put them on the map for us to adopt on the Vermont layer.
So you gave the example of the owner who put the driveway in place and finds out that he's in violation. So is the responsibility on a property owner to go to the map?
Correct. It is the responsibility of a landowner to be in compliance with any and all rules and regulations. And so that starts with local town zoning, because different towns have different town zoning. A person needs to know that they can comply with their town zoning. Then they will check to see if they need any state state permits, a wastewater permit, a wetland permit, a stream alteration permit, a lakes permit. Then they see if they need a federal permit, because some of these resources are also regulated under the Army Corps of Engineers. And so, yes, as a landowner, when you have a proposed project, you need to know which rules and regulations apply and to ensure that you have the permits for those.
I'm just thinking we need to redo our zoning regs.
That is a different conversation, and one I'm very happy to have with you. And it is a conversation I've had with many towns about zoning bylaws when it comes to waterways, lakes and ponds, and wetlands. Yes.
All right, let's get the next question from the chat. Okay. Was landowner permission obtained for the field checks that were done? Yes, they were. They were done on public property, roadside, and where we had permission to access the property. Question from the room? No? Okay. Oh, we got one?
Another one.
Yeah.
So if someone has a particular newly identified wetland that they disagree with, what is the process that they should follow?
Do you want to go back to that slide to show them the location specific area where they?
Yeah, so you can go to the maps here and comment on it specifically. The map doesn't really affect the person unless they want to do work there and there's a wetland, so they could also, when they have a project in mind, contact their district wetlands ecologist, which would be Zapata in this area, and, you know, have her go out and see if the wetland is where the map says the wetland is. And we can revise it accordingly. They can get a delineation, and, a lot of the work that we do is to help people avoid and minimize impacts to wetlands and buffer zones so that they can do projects without having to get a permit because they can avoid the area. So they can certainly comment though through this process, but they can also comment later, like the map is understood, it's dynamic. Wetlands are dynamic. They can change over time, like we've seen with these floods, especially, you know, boundaries can change. So at any time that landowner wants to understand precisely where the wetland is, we can work on that with them.
You define the word work. If someone wants to do work.
Yeah, so activity, so they want to change the grading with the bulldozer, they want to clear vegetation, other than for maintaining silvicultural practices. If they want to build a house, build a driveway, put in new ditches, all of those types of activities. And we have, I mentioned before, there's a list of allowed uses, which are activities that don't need a permit, and I can follow up with you and give you that list, so you have it.
Basically, the short is any activity that results in ground disturbance, removal of vegetation, ditching, excavation, placement of fill, grading, movement of earth. You should be asking the question as to whether you need a permit or not.
So we have a question in the chat. Can you later provide net changes for other towns? Yes, I can do that. I'll just reiterate that not all towns that are involved in this mapping are 100% mapped, so it'll just be for those areas that are within the watersheds of interest.
And Laura, if you provide me with those, I can probably send them out. I know Craig, and we can send them out to different folks.
Yep.
And we answered Melanie's about when the public hearing period ends, which is June 20th. And then Alice has a question, a multi-section question, which I did my best to break down and answer below.
Okay. Alice says, isn't one of the goals of the projects to realize a net gain of wetlands and identifying more class 1 wetlands and to identify wetlands that should be restored? Zapata said, no, that is not the goal for this process. The goals of this process is to increase the accuracy of wetland mapping throughout the state and provide better information about the potential wetlands on a property. The net gain you reference is from recent legislation on the Flood Resiliency Act. That's Act 121, which specifies the permitting process. So there was an act last legislative session that said that with permits, we're now required to have a net gain of wetlands, which means whenever someone is impacting a wetland, they need to restore more wetland elsewhere in return for it. Do we have another question here in the room?
Yeah, I had
a colleague
Can
asked,
you please state your name?
oh, sure, Mary Beth Foley,
Thank you.
ask about so you talked about when someone wants to do work on the land, they might need a permit. But can you talk a little bit about, when land purchase happens, like a land is for sale, does the seller have any responsibility versus the buyer? For
Mhm.
finding out if there are wetlands there?
Yeah, so the question was, what's the responsibility of the buyer or the seller when there's a land changing hands? It really depends on what the person wants to do. If someone's purchasing a property because they want to develop that parcel, they should be looking and asking about whether there's wetlands there. And I don't know of any legal cases where someone has successfully sued someone for not
Hmm.
disclosing wetland information. You know of one?
Yep, I had one 2 years ago in Killington where a landowner had advertised the lot as developable. And then due to the extent of wetlands on the lot, it was deemed to be a swamp lot and unable to support septic, and therefore it was no longer able to be developed. And the purchaser went back to the seller and sued them as a breach of contract and false advertising. And the seller had to take back the land, return the monies and pay all the legal costs and any of the work that had already been completed. So it is important for landowners who are selling lands to be realistic in the listing and description of the properties. I have done a webinar with the Moncton Conservation Commission, and it is still recorded about what you can do on your land when wetlands are present. And that can answer a lot of questions. So we do have swamp lots in Vermont. The majority of the areas closest to the Otter Creek are swamp lots. And they're owned by people because back in the day, they were specifically purchased in order to harvest cedar for fence posts. Now, a lot of times, some of these lots are no longer even associated with a person any longer, but they would be considered swamp lots and considered undevelopable. You could still, for example, go duck hunting, which is an allowed use. But there would certainly be restrictions on other activities that might be proposed. Does that answer your question?
Okay, and someone was asking about how do agricultural lands play into wetland classifications? There are a couple new additions within the municipality I work for that are on or near lands used for agriculture. So that gets into those allowed uses I've been mentioning before. And there's also specific agricultural exemptions. So if there's a newly mapped area that is on agricultural land, as long as it's still being used to grow food and crop, that doesn't change anything. They can continue to do that use. It's if it changes hands or is proposed for development that map really matters. So it does not mean that those agricultural areas now have to stop growing food in those areas. Those can all still continue.
And one clarification on that is agricultural lands themselves don't play into wetland classifications. The historic use of agricultural lands has an impact on whether or not the area can continue to be farmed. And that is the growing of food and crop. A lot of those areas are either an allowed use or an exception. However, as soon as you are planning on doing an activity that removes an area from growing food or crop, then those wetlands, if they meet those criteria I mentioned before, half acre in size, mapped, vernal pool, etc., then you may still require a wetland permit. But that's true today, whether those areas are mapped as wetland or not. And one of the challenges of this watershed is we're very flat, and it can be really challenging to aerially identify where wetlands are. So we do know that in some cases, some wetlands that are currently occurring on agricultural lands have not been mapped. And if a farmer or a landowner wants to now put in a pond, make a new ditch, put in solar, do a new subdivision, access road, barns, manure pit, etc., then you may still require a wetland permit regardless of whether those wetlands have been mapped or not. And we have a hand up online as well from Karina. Do you want to take that now or open it to the room?
I think you have a question
It's
related.
to-
Yeah, okay, we'll do that first and then we'll jump to Karina. Yeah.
Sorry, Karina. Just to point out, that if you're clearing new land for agriculture, that's not an allowed use, right? Like,
Correct,
If you're
yeah.
cutting down trees.
So if you have a natural wetland that you want to convert into a cornfield, you would need to get a permit to do that sort of thing. So, we're talking about areas that are existing fields. Thank you. Yep, okay, Karina, can I unmute your mic?
Yes, Karina is off mute. Go ahead, Karina.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. This is Karina Daly, restoration ecologist with Vermont Natural Resources Council. This presentation was excellent. Thank you so much. It's super helpful, and I find it so interesting that we've had so much change in our wetland shapes in the Otter Creek, for example, and it just goes to show that these wetlands are not new. They've always been there, but now we can see them better. And that transparency, I think, is really important for the public as we plan where we put our development in the future. And we work to improve and protect the services that wetlands provide to our society for water quality, flood protection, wildlife, and recreation. I know that working as a consulting ecologist, wetland scientist, I had a lot of frustration with, dealing with cases where landowners really purchased properties that they didn't realize were all wetlands, or built houses in areas that they didn't realize were wetlands because the mapping wasn't accurate. So really excited to see this, and thank you for your hard work on this.
All right, thanks for your comment, Karina. We'll jump back into the chat. Who would apply for a class 1 wetland? So that is a rulemaking process. Anyone can petition. It then goes to the agency and our commissioner has to decide whether we're going to initiate rulemaking. Class 1 wetlands, for those that don't know, are wetlands that are considered the most irreplaceable in the state, and you can't get a permit to do work within it unless there's a compelling need for public health or safety. So it is a higher level of protection. There is no change to the class 1 maps from this edit. And I've lost my scrolling button, so I can't.
And
Sorry.
I put in the chat to give a quick summary of that to Alice. And the class 1 process is a lengthy process. It needs to demonstrate that the area in question actually meets the requirement of a class 1, which is that exceptional or irreplaceable value. It does require multiple public meetings and public notice process, and more importantly, it's a legal rule change, which means it has to be approved by our legislative bodies in order to be adopted. And I did put a link in for the class 1 petition if anybody is interested. We have had Conservation Commission petition one successfully. We've had VNRC, the Vermont Natural Resource Council, I want to say Conservation, has successfully petitioned one, and you can see where our class 1s are currently on our website under the class 1 interactive map, including some additional wetlands that would probably meet the criteria of class 1, but they have not yet been petitioned. In June, just because I can say this, Eshqua Bog down in Heartland, which is a plethora of orchid blooming flowers right now, is a class 1 wetland petitioned by the Nature Conservancy for recreation. So there's a lot of different functions and values for why our wetlands might be considered class 1. And Karina, you have your hand up again. I don't know if it was left standing or if you had another comment or question.
Sorry about that. I just took it down.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, that's all the questions that are in the chat. Any other questions, or anyone want to look at the map together? We could do that too, but we have a question in the room.
Mine's more comment.
Yeah.
I'm concerned about the communication about this. I mean,
Okay.
I'm here because I'm the chair of the select board of the town of Leicester, and I saw the material that came through about it. I'm concerned that John Q. Public doesn't know about the changes that have occurred and how it seems, at least from what little bit I saw from Matt and Julie was holding, the possible implications for some of the property owners. And if the onus is on the property owner, again, I'm concerned about how to get that information out to people. I feel they need to know. I don't want to alarm anyone in town, but they also need to be aware. And I'm not sure how we're supposed to, I'm not sure how we're supposed to proceed from here.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that comment. For those online, the comment is about making sure Joe Public understands what the maps mean and what wetland regulations mean in general. Yeah.
What they may or may not be able to do on their property.
Yeah, certainly. And that's a challenge for our program, besides this mapping effort, because like we've said, these wetlands are protected without being on the maps, and we don't want to catch people off guard. We want them to know about it. Last year, we did a media campaign called Check for Wetlands Before You Buy or Build. It went on Connect TV. We had a commercial. We also had a social media presence, and we're sending out flyers to town clerks and such. For this mapping effort, we posted on Front Porch Forum, press releases, and multiple listservs, including like the Realtor organization, wastewater designers, and such. So if you have other ideas for like how we can help get the message out, and yes, we're not trying to alarm people, we're just trying to like inform them. I'm all ears for other suggestions, because like in your town position, you have a different perspective that can be really valuable for us to understand. So I guess, we're trying, and we want to get in touch more. So we'll continue that effort. We still have those materials from the buy and build campaign that we can rerun on various channels and such too. We also have flyers that we can send to your town that you can have at the town offices that gives you information on like how to identify wetlands on your property and who to reach out to and things like that.
Can you remind me of your name?
Diane Benware?
Yeah, hi, Diane.
Hi.
So I'm Zapata. I'm the district wetland ecologist, so good to see you. We can do a number of things that are town specific. I've certainly have done educational presentations before if you thought that people would actually come. I know some towns have town-wide email lists. And, you know, whether it's for the recreation committee or the, you know, town meeting committee, we can provide material that could go out into a town-wide email that's specific to your town coming from you as opposed to Front Porch Forum, which we have done. So, yeah, there could be some different strategies for getting the word out. I think what some of the misconceptions is like that this is new. And in one respect it is because it's new mapping. So there's a heightened awareness because now we're trying to reach out again.
Right.
But our first set of wetland rules started in 1990, and our second set, which really is what applies today, was in 2010. So having wetland rules is not necessarily new. The mapping just highlights it, puts it back in the news. And I will be the first to admit, not all landowners know that they should be looking for wetlands. And that's part of my job is to work with town clerks, zoning administrators when projects come in. I have a couple of towns that will specifically email me every time that there's a new project and have me do a desktop review before they sign off on, say, a building permit, for example. So there could be a number of different strategies depending on what might be best for your town.
I'll pause for a moment to see if there's any other questions someone might be typing.
Well, Alice had another question that came in. She said, I heard that the position of the A&R permit specialist no longer exists. Is this correct?
That is a different part of our department. I believe that they've all been changed to municipal assistance staff who were permit specialists. So they are working more with the municipalities, and yes, there's now an online tool that people can answer questions on there and find out what permits they need. But I do believe that there are some staff members who are still available for that one-on-one conversation. So I don't want to say that they're like entirely gone. I'd want to follow up on that.
And so Alice, it's I won't say in place of the permit specialist, but an alternative is the permit navigator, which can be found online. And here's another tool for towns. We also have the wetland screening tool, where you can either put in your 911 address or your SPAN number, and it will give you a report about the likelihood of having wetlands on your property, where it's looking at all of the different tools, all the different mapping that might be happening in or around your property, and then spitting out a report that says, hey, because of this, you should be contacting your ecologist to see if you might have any wetland concerns on your land. And that can be incredibly helpful. We're also working with wastewater designers so that if there are different criteria like hydric soils or waterways or wetlands that are on or near your property, that with a submittal of a wastewater permit, it will also notify the wetland program and the landowner that you might have wetland concerns. And hopefully that's to catch folks early in any type of development planning process to factor in the potential of having wetlands on your site.
All right. Any other questions?
Craig is typing.
Okay.
And Craig, if you want to take yourself off mute, you could also ask your question if that's easier.
Yeah, hi, this is Craig Heindel. I would just add that this has been very, very helpful, and I'm glad that these maps are being updated. The two tools that you talked about, the online permit navigator and the wetland screening tool, we've used those both for Ferrisburg proposed projects, and they're very helpful. So I would encourage people to use them. We find them useful.
Great, thank you, Craig. And I've worked with you a lot too in doing desktop reviews to assist as well. So all the tools and resources.
And I'll say that the map updates will be incorporated into the screening tool as well as the permit navigator once it's officially adopted. All right, well, this isn't your only opportunity to ask questions, and this is on public notice until June 20th, end of day, June 20th. There's also another public meeting next week in Montpelier, also virtually, that you can attend and provide comment. And like I was saying before, the maps can always be updated. This isn't your only opportunity to comment on it. There will be opportunities when you get it delineated or you have a project and have a question and things like that. Craig, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks for indicating that schedule also. So just what's your sense of after the June 20 public comment period, how many weeks or months after that do you expect that these maps will be formally adopted and on the atlas and on the wetland mapping and all that stuff?
Great question. It really depends on how many comments we receive, if there's edits that need to be made. I feel like for the Missisquoi updates after the public comment period, it was maybe a month and a half when they got added to the official maps with some changes due to comments. So I would, don't hold me to it, but there's an estimate for you.
And I put the link to the ENB, the Environmental Notice Bulletin, in the chat. And that is another way in which to submit your public comments, is by registering with the ENB and going to this particular project and entering in any comments on that screen.
And through the environmental notice bulletin, you can sign up for updates. So if you want to know when it's, when it has been adopted, you can get an email directly to your email box if you sign up there. All right. Well, with that, I will end the official meeting. Thanks everybody for attending. Looks like folks have started dropping off from the chat virtually. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or comments. Thanks, everybody. This concludes our meeting. Have a good evening.
Thank you.